My name carries no weight in the circles where I've spent my career, but the estates I've managed do. For 11 years, I oversaw winter properties for families whose names appear on hospital wings and university libraries. The Caldwell Winter Estate in Aspen was my final assignment, and the reason I no longer work in private management. The property sprawled across 4 to 7 acres of pristine Colorado mountainside, accessible only through a private gate that required keys and a security code changed monthly. The main residence featured 12 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, and a great room with windows spanning floor to ceiling. Every detail had been designed for absolute privacy and comfort during the family's annual December retreats. I arrived on November 15th, 2012, 6 weeks before the Caldwells' expected arrival. My responsibility was comprehensive staffing coordination, security protocols, maintenance oversight, and ensuring the property remained undisturbed during the family's absence. The estate employed a skeleton crew year-rounder groundskeeper to housekeepers, and a security specialist who monitored the perimeter cameras from a small office near the service entrance. The snow began falling on November 21st, and by Thanksgiving week the estate was blanketed in 3 feet of untouched powder. I maintained detailed logs of everything: deliveries, weather conditions, staff schedules, and security reports. The Caldwells demanded precision in all matters, and I had built my reputation on providing exactly that. What I documented in those logs during the first week of December defied every rational explanation I could construct. But the footprints in the snow were undeniably real, and they led somewhere no footprints should ever lead. The Caldwell family had owned the Aspen property since 1978. When Theodore Caldwell purchased it as a retreat from his Manhattan-based investment firm, his son Marcus inherited both the business and the estate, maintaining the tradition of December gatherings that brought 3 generations together for the holidays. Marcus Caldwell was methodical in ways that bordered on obsessive. He provided me with a 40-page manual detailing every aspect of estate management, from the precise temperature settings for each room to the specific brands of amenities stocked in guest bathrooms. The family's routines were documented with military precision: cocktails at 6:30, dinner at 8, morning coffee served at exactly 7:15. The staff quarters occupied a separate building connected to the main house by a heated walkway. I maintained an apartment there along with Maria Santos, the head housekeeper, and James Morrison, the groundskeeper. The security specialist, David Park, lived off-property but maintained 24-hour monitoring capabilities through the estate's comprehensive camera system. During my tenure, I had grown accustomed to the peculiarities of wealthy families. The Caldwells were no different in their demands for privacy and order, but they possessed an unusual preoccupation with the estate's perimeter. Every window featured custom-installed sensors, and motion detectors covered every approach to the property. Marcus had emphasized repeatedly that any disturbance, no matter how minor, required immediate documentation and notification. The security measures seemed excessive for a vacation home, but I had learned not to question the preferences of my employers. Wealthy families often developed paranoia about their privacy, and the Caldwells paid handsomely for absolute discretion and comprehensive protection. I provided both without hesitation or inquiry. The first footprints appeared on December 3rd, during a snowstorm that had isolated the estate for 36 hours. I discovered them during my morning perimeter check, a routine I performed daily regardless of weather conditions. The tracks emerged from the tree line approximately 50 yards north of the main house and proceeded directly toward the building's foundation. What troubled me immediately was not their presence, but their impossibility. The snow had fallen continuously since midnight, accumulating for inches by dawn. Yet these footprints appeared crisp and recent, as though someone had walked through fresh powder only minutes before my arrival. The depth and definition suggested an adult male, size 11 or 12 boots, walking with purposeful strides toward the house. I followed the tracks to their terminus, the stone foundation beneath the library windows. There, they simply ended. No return path existed, no disturbance in the snow surrounding the endpoint, no evidence of how the walker had departed. I examined the foundation carefully, checking for signs of forced entry or damage. The windows remained locked and undisturbed, their sensors active and unbreached. Protocol demanded immediate notification of any security anomaly. I photographed the footprints from multiple angles and documented their dimensions, depth, and trajectory in my daily report. David Park reviewed the overnight camera footage but found no corresponding visual record. The motion sensors had remained silent throughout the night. Maria Santos suggested wildlife might have created the impressions, but the pattern was unmistakably human. Morrison proposed that wind patterns might have carved deceptive shapes in the snow, but the tracks displayed clear heel and toe definition. We found no rational explanation, yet the evidence remained undeniably present in the snow. I increased security patrols and reviewed all access points to the estate. The main gate showed no signs of tampering, and the perimeter fencing remained intact. The groundskeeper confirmed that all staff members had remained on the property throughout the storm, and our small crew accounted for each other's whereabouts during the relevant time frame. The footprints melted by noon as temperatures rose above freezing, eliminating the physical evidence but not my unease. I sent Marcus Caldwell a detailed email describing the incident, including photographs and my assessment that the estate's security remained intact despite the unexplained tracks. His response arrived within hours: increase surveillance, document everything, and maintain absolute discretion. 3 days later, during another overnight snowfall, the footprints returned. This time, they followed a different route, emerging from the eastern tree line and approaching the house from the side. The pattern was identical fresh tracks in newly fallen snow, leading directly to the foundation before disappearing without return evidence. The endpoint shifted to beneath the dining room windows. I began setting motion-activated cameras along the perimeter, focusing on areas where the tracks had appeared. The devices were military-grade, capable of detecting movement in complete darkness and extreme weather conditions. Morrison helped me position them strategically, creating overlapping fields of coverage that should capture any approach to the house. The Caldwells were scheduled to arrive in 10 days. Marcus had made clear that their December retreat must proceed without disturbance or disruption. My responsibility was ensuring their complete comfort and privacy, which meant resolving this mystery before their arrival. The footprints suggested we were not as alone on the estate as we had assumed. On December 8th, the motion cameras captured something that contradicted every logical explanation I could construct. The footage showed clear movement approaching the house at 2:17 in the morning, but the figure remained somehow indistinct, as though the camera couldn't quite focus on the approaching form. The timestamp verified that something had triggered the sensors, and the snow showed fresh footprints the following morning. Yet the visual record provided no clear image of who or what had made the approach. The figure appeared as a shadowy outline, human in proportions but lacking definitive features or clothing details. I reviewed the footage repeatedly, adjusting contrast and brightness settings. But the image quality remained frustratingly unclear. David Park examined the equipment and confirmed the cameras were functioning properly. The sensors had detected body heat and movement consistent with a human presence, yet the visual evidence remained maddeningly vague. Maria Santos grew increasingly nervous about the situation. She had worked for the Caldwell family for 8 years and had never experienced anything comparable. During our morning staff meeting, she mentioned that her grandmother had spoken of mountain spirits that appeared during harsh winters. But I dismissed such explanations as superstition. Morrison suggested we contact local law enforcement, but Marcus Caldwell's instructions were explicit. Handle all security matters privately and discreetly. The family valued their privacy above all considerations, and involving outside authorities would violate the trust they had placed in my management. The footprints now appeared every night it snowed, always approaching the house from different directions, always ending at the foundation without return paths. I began sleeping with my phone beside me, monitoring the camera feeds throughout the night, hoping to catch a clearer image. The pattern continued for 5 consecutive nights. Each morning brought fresh evidence of the nocturnal visitor, and each evening's camera footage provided the same frustratingly unclear images. The figure appeared to know exactly how to approach the house, while remaining partially obscured from our surveillance equipment. I began keeping detailed charts of the approach routes, timing, and weather conditions. A troubling pattern emerged. The footprints only appeared during snowstorms, as though the visitor required fresh powder to mark their passage. On clear nights, nothing disturbed the estate's perimeter. Marcus Caldwell called on December 10th to review security preparations for the family's arrival. I provided a comprehensive briefing on staff readiness, maintenance completion, and supply inventory, but I hesitated to mention the continuing footprint incidents. His emphasis on maintaining normal operations made me reluctant to alarm him with what might be dismissed as weather-related anomalies. During the conversation, he asked specifically about the foundation security, a term that puzzled me. When I requested clarification, he paused before stating that the estate's basement areas required particular attention during winter months. I assured him that all lower levels remained secure and climate-controlled, though I wondered why he had singled out those spaces. After the call, I conducted a thorough examination of the estate's basement and sub-levels. The house featured a substantial lower level that included storage areas, mechanical systems, and what appeared to be an unused apartment. All access points were properly sealed, and the spaces showed no signs of disturbance or unauthorized entry. Yet I noticed that the footprints consistently ended at foundation points directly above the basement areas, as though the visitor was somehow drawn to those specific locations. The Caldwell family arrived on December 13th, bringing their usual holiday entourage, Marcus and his wife Jennifer, their adult daughter Sarah with her husband, and Marcus's elderly father Theodore, now 87 and requiring assistance with mobility. I coordinated their arrival logistics while maintaining careful surveillance of the property's perimeter. Sarah Caldwell Morrison had retained her maiden name, professionally was a federal prosecutor based in Washington. Her husband, Robert Morrison, worked in international banking. They were a formidable couple, accustomed to privacy and security in their professional lives, making them particularly suited to the estate's isolated environment. Theodore Caldwell moved slowly but remained mentally sharp. During his first evening at the estate, he asked me to join him in the library after dinner. The request was unusual. I typically maintain distance from family members during their retreats, but I complied with his invitation. "You've been documenting unusual activity," he stated without preamble, settling into a leather chair beside the fireplace. His directness surprised me. I had not discussed the footprint incidents with any family members. I confirmed that I had noted some anomalies in my security reports, but assured him that the estate remained completely secure. His pale blue eyes studied my face carefully before he nodded slowly. "My grandfather built this house in 1878, he said, correcting the date I had been given. "The family has maintained it for 5 generations. There are aspects of the property that require particular understanding." He asked me to continue my documentation, but to report any further incidents directly to him rather than to Marcus. His tone suggested this was not a request, but an instruction I was expected to follow without question. Theodore's revelation about the estate's true age troubled me more than I could articulate. If the house had been built in 1878, it predated Marcus's stated purchase date by a full century. The discrepancy suggested deliberate misinformation about the property's history, though I could not understand why such deception would be necessary. That night, fresh snow began falling at 11:30. I positioned myself in the library with a clear view of the northern approach, hoping to observe the mysterious visitor directly rather than relying on camera footage. The family had retired to their rooms, and the estate settled into its typical late-evening quiet. At 1:47 in the morning, I saw movement among the trees. A figure emerged from the forest, walking steadily toward the house through the falling snow. Even with direct observation, the person remained somehow indistinct, as though my eyes could not quite focus on their features or clothing. The figure followed the now familiar path directly to the foundation, stopping beneath the library windows where I sat watching. For several minutes, the visitor remained motionless, and I had the unsettling sensation that they were aware of my presence behind the glass. Then, as always, they simply vanished, leaving only footprints in the snow. I immediately went outside to examine the tracks. They were identical to all previous instances, clear, deep impressions of adult boots, ending abruptly at the foundation with no evidence of departure. The snow around the endpoint remained completely undisturbed, as though the walker had simply ceased to exist. I documented everything in my report for Theodore, including the timing and my direct observation of the incident. Theodore reviewed my report the following morning and asked me to accompany him to the estate's basement levels. We descended through a door I had noticed but never thoroughly investigated, located in a corridor behind the kitchen. The basement was more extensive than I had realized, featuring multiple rooms and corridors that extended well beyond the footprint of the house above. The original structure was much larger, Theodore explained as we walked through the underground spaces. My grandfather was a mining engineer who made his fortune in Colorado silver. He built this as more than a vacation home. It was intended as a complete mountain compound. We entered a room that appeared to be a study, furnished with antique furniture and lined with bookshelves. Maps covered one wall, showing the local mountain terrain in extraordinary detail. Many of the maps appeared hand-drawn, featuring elevations and geological formations not included on standard topographical surveys. Theodore pointed to a specific area marked on the largest map. The mine entrance was located approximately here, he said, indicating a spot in the forest north of the house. It was sealed in 1923 after the last of the profitable veins were exhausted. He turned to face me directly. The footprints you've been documenting follow the exact path workers used to travel between the mine and the house. The route was used daily for 45 years. The revelation provided context but not explanation. The mine had been sealed for nearly 90 years. Yet someone or something continued to walk that long-abandoned path during snowstorms, approaching the house as though reporting for work that no longer existed. Theodore led me to a heavy wooden cabinet in the corner of the underground study. Inside, he retrieved a leather-bound journal filled with handwritten entries dating back to the 1880s. The pages documented daily operations of the mining operation, including personnel records, production notes, and incident reports. My grandfather was meticulous about record-keeping, Theodore said, opening the journal to entries from December 1895. He noted everything that occurred on the property, including events he couldn't adequately explain. The journal entries described winter phenomena remarkably similar to what I had been documenting. Workers reported seeing figures walking the mine path during snowstorms, always approaching the house but never arriving. The sightings occurred exclusively during December nights when fresh snow was falling. One entry from December 21st, 1895 provided disturbing details. A mine supervisor named Thomas Brennan had been found dead in the snow along the path, despite having been seen alive in town that same evening. His body showed no signs of trauma or illness, and the circumstances of his death remained unexplained. He was buried in the local cemetery, but workers continued reporting his figure walking the path throughout that winter. Theodore closed the journal carefully. The mine claimed 11 men during its operational years. Cave-ins, equipment failures, accidents that should have been preventable. My grandfather began to believe the mountain itself, resented the intrusion. I asked why the family continued to maintain the property given its troubled history. Theodore smiled grimly. Because abandoning it would be worse. The mountain remembers everyone who took from it. Leaving ensures they would have no peace, and neither would we. The footprints appeared again that night, but this time they followed a route I had not previously observed. Instead of approaching the house directly, the tracks circled the entire property, passing near each outbuilding and structure before finally converging on the main residence. The pattern suggested a comprehensive survey of the estate, as though the visitor was conducting some form of inspection. I reported the new development to Theodore during our morning meeting. He received the information with apparent resignation rather than surprise, confirming my growing suspicion that these incidents were not unprecedented. The family had been dealing with this phenomenon for generations. They're becoming more active, Theodore observed, studying the photographs I had taken. December has always been the most difficult month, but the intensity varies from year to year. Some winter see nothing. Others, single quotes, he left the sentence incomplete. Marcus approached me later that morning to discuss holiday, logistics and meal planning, but his attention seemed divided. During our conversation, he repeatedly glanced toward the windows, and I noticed he avoided looking directly at the northern tree line where the footprints typically originated. Sarah and her husband appeared increasingly tense as their stay progressed. During dinner conversations, they frequently referenced their eagerness to return to Washington, citing work commitments that seemed insufficient to explain their obvious discomfort. Jennifer Caldwell maintained social pleasantries but moved through the house as though expecting to encounter something unpleasant. The family's collective any suggested they were aware of the estate's peculiarities, though no one had spoken directly about the nocturnal visitors. Their behaviour indicated a shared understanding of something they preferred not to acknowledge or discuss. On December 17th, the footprints multiplied. Instead of a single set of tracks approaching the house, I discovered 3 distinct paths converging from different directions. The prints varied in size and depth, suggesting multiple individuals of different builds and ages. All 3 routes terminated at the foundation beneath different windows, creating a pattern that surrounded the main residence. The escalation alarmed me sufficiently that I requested an immediate meeting with Marcus Caldwell. I found him in his father's basement study, examining the mining journals with obvious familiarity. Both men looked up when I entered, and their expressions suggested they had been anticipating this conversation. "It's getting worse," I stated directly, providing them with the morning's photographs. Marcus studied the images while Theodore nodded knowingly. "The anniversary approaches," Theodore said simply. "December 21st has always been the most difficult date. The winter solstice was when my grandfather sealed the mine permanently." Marcus set down the photographs. "We've been discussing whether to cut the visit short this year. The activity seems more intense than usual, and we're concerned about the family's comfort." I asked what they knew about the individuals, whose footprints appeared nightly around their property. Theodore exchanged a glance with his son before responding. "The men who died in the mine never left the mountain. We believe they continue to report for work, following routines they established during their lifetimes. They're not malevolent, but their presence can be unsettling. The admission that the family knew they were hosting deceased miners each winter explained their nervous behaviour and heightened security measures. They were not protecting themselves from intruders, but from employees who refused to acknowledge their termination. Theodore retrieved another journal from the cabinet, this one more recent, dating to the 1950s. My father documented similar incidents during his management of the estate. The pattern has remained consistent across generations. Increased activity during December, multiple figures walking familiar routes. No direct contact with the living. He opened the journal to a detailed entry describing December 20th, 1953. The writer Theodore's father had counted 7 distinct sets of footprints surrounding the house that morning. Photographs included with the entry showed tracks identical to what I had been documenting, confirming that the phenomenon had continued unchanged for decades. We've learned to coexist with them, Marcus explained. They don't enter the house or threaten the family's safety. They simply maintain their routines as though the mine were still operational. I asked why they didn't relocate their holiday. Celebrations to avoid the annual disturbances. Theodore's expression grew stern. This is our responsibility, he stated firmly. My grandfather profited from their labour and their deaths. The family has an obligation to provide them with a place to continue their work, even if that work no longer serves any purpose. The ethical dimension of the situation had not occurred to me. The Caldwells viewed the nocturnal visitations not as hauntings, but as employment relationships that death had failed to terminate. They maintained the estate partly to honour contracts with workers who had died in service to the family business. Sarah appeared in the doorway, interrupting our conversation. "They're back," she announced quietly. In broad daylight this time, we followed Sarah to the main floor, where she led us to the great room's expansive windows. Outside, clearly visible against the white snow, 3 figures moved slowly across the estate grounds. Unlike the nocturnal visitors who remained frustratingly indistinct, these daytime apparitions appeared solid and clearly defined. The figures wore work clothing appropriate to late 19th century mining operations, heavy coats, wool caps, and boots suitable for mountain terrain. They carried tools, shovels, pickaxes, and canvas bags as though reporting for a shift that would never begin. Their movements were deliberate and purposeful, following paths that led toward the sealed mine entrance. Jennifer Caldwell joined us at the windows, her face pale but composed. "This happened when Theodore was a child," she said quietly. His father wrote about daylight sightings during particularly active winters. The figures moved with the steady pace of men, accustomed to physical labour. They showed no awareness of our observation, focusing entirely on their route toward the forest. As they reached the tree line, they paused momentarily as though waiting for instructions or permission to proceed. Then, simultaneously, all 3 turned toward the house. Even at a distance of more than 100 yards, their attention felt focused and intentional. They remained motionless for nearly a minute, watching the building where their employers' descendants maintained their winter residence. Marcus moved away from the window. "They know we're here," he said simply. "They've always known. We represent the connection to their work, their purpose for remaining on the mountain." The figures resumed their walk toward the sealed mine, disappearing among the trees as though they had never existed. The family held an emergency meeting that evening to discuss accelerating their departure. Sarah and Robert were adamant about leaving immediately, citing concerns about their young children back in Washington. Jennifer supported an early departure, noting that the daytime appearances represented an escalation beyond previous years' activity. Theodore argued for maintaining their planned schedule. "Running away dishonours the agreement," he insisted. "The solstice marks the anniversary of the mine's closure. We owe them our presence through that date." Marcus found himself mediating between his father's sense of obligation and his family's growing anxiety. As the estate manager, my role was to ensure everyone's comfort and safety, but the situation had evolved beyond standard security protocols. During the discussion, I learned additional details about the estate's history. The mine had been sealed on December 21st, 1895, after a final cave-in trapped to workers underground. Their bodies were never recovered, and the family had chosen to close the operation permanently rather than risk additional casualties. Grandfather felt responsible for their deaths, Theodore explained. He spent the rest of his life trying to make amends to their families and to their spirits. Maintaining this property was part of that commitment. The ethical complexity of the situation became clearer. The Caldwells weren't simply dealing with supernatural phenomena, they were honouring a century-old, promised to provide sanctuary for men who had died in service to their families' wealth. Yet the increasing intensity of the manifestations suggested something had changed. The workers seemed more desperate, more determined to complete whatever task drew them nightly to the house. I spent that night monitoring the perimeter with heightened vigilance. The footprints appeared again, but this time they formed a more complex pattern around the house. Instead of simply approaching and disappearing, the tracks suggested the visitors had remained for extended periods, walking circuits around the building as though conducting some form of patrol. At 3-20-7 in the morning, I heard sounds from the basement level. Not footsteps or voices, but the rhythmic tapping of metal against stone, as though someone were working with mining tools. The sounds continued for nearly an hour before fading into silence. I investigated the basement immediately, finding no signs of intrusion or disturbance. Yet the stone foundation walls showed fresh scratches and marks that had not been present during my previous inspections. The marks appeared to be deliberate, forming patterns that might have been early attempts at communication. Theodore examined the marks the following morning and identified them as mining symbols used to indicate direction and depth in underground passages. They're trying to tell us something, he concluded, tracing the carved lines with his finger. The symbols suggested the presence of an underground tunnel or chamber that extended beyond the known basement areas. Theodore consulted his grandfather's maps, discovering references to emergency passages that connected the mine to the house foundation. Grandfather built escape routes in case of catastrophic mine failures, Theodore explained. If workers were trapped underground, they could reach the house through these tunnels. The realization that hidden passages might still connect the sealed mine to the estate's foundation added new urgency to our situation. The deceased miners weren't just visiting, they were trying to complete their journey home. Theodore decided we needed to locate the tunnel entrance within the basement. Using his grandfather's maps and the fresh symbols carved in the foundation walls, we began a systematic search of the underground areas. Behind a storage room filled with old furniture, we discovered a stone wall that appeared newer than the surrounding foundation. Marcus helped us move the stored items, revealing that the wall featured a hidden opening concealed behind a heavy wooden panel. Theodore's grandfather had sealed this passage, but time and mountain settling had created gaps that would allow someone or something to pass through. This is how they've been reaching the house, Theodore realized. Not walking across the snow, but travelling through the original tunnel system. The footprints we've been seeing are just the final portion of their journey. The tunnel beyond the hidden opening extended into darkness, sloping downward toward the mountain. Air currents from the passage carried scents of earth and stone, along with something else, the lingering smell of old wood and metal that suggested the presence of abandoned mining equipment. I volunteered to explore the tunnel, but Theodore refused to allow it. Some discoveries carry obligations we're not prepared to accept, he said firmly. If they're trapped in there, finding them means taking responsibility for their liberation. Marcus supported his father's decision. The family had maintained their arrangement with the deceased workers for over a century by respecting boundaries and avoiding direct confrontation with the supernatural elements of the estate. Yet the increasing intensity of the manifestations suggested those boundaries were breaking down, forcing a resolution the family had long avoided. On December 20th, the night before the anniversary of the mine's closure, the activity reached unprecedented levels. The motion cameras detected continuous movement around the property from sunset until dawn. Footprints in the snow created intricate patterns that covered nearly every approach to the house. The sounds from the basement became more frequent and intense. Throughout the night, we heard what sounded like multiple individuals working with hand tools, accompanied by occasional voices speaking words we could not clearly understand. The family gathered in the main floor living areas, avoiding the basement entirely. Sarah and her husband departed that morning despite Theodore's objections. "We've honoured the family obligation," she told her grandfather firmly. "But I won't risk my children's safety for the sake of guilty consciences 3 generations old." Her departure created tension between Theodore and Marcus, who found himself torn between family unity and filial duty. Jennifer supported her husband but clearly shared Theodore's concerns about abandoning the estate during the critical anniversary period. I maintained my position throughout these family discussions, though privately I shared the younger generation's desire to leave. The supernatural activity had escalated beyond anything resembling normal phenomenon, and I questioned whether continuing to enable it served anyone's interests, living or dead. Yet Theodore's conviction about the family's obligations was unshakable. "Tomorrow marks 117 years since the mine was sealed," he reminded US. "The men trapped inside have waited more than a century for acknowledgement. We cannot abandon them now." The moral weight of his argument was impossible to dismiss, even as the practical dangers of remaining grew increasingly apparent. December 21st arrived with heavy snowfall and temperatures well below freezing. The anniversary of the mine's closure brought an atmosphere of expectation that seemed to affect even the natural world around the estate. The wind carried unusual sounds, and the forest appeared more threatening than welcoming. Theodore spent the day in the basement study, reading his grandfather's journals and preparing for what he described as the final accounting. Marcus and Jennifer remained upstairs, monitoring weather reports and discussing contingency plans for emergency departure. As estate manager, I found myself caught between my professional obligations and my personal concerns about the safety of everyone on the property. The supernatural activity had clearly been building toward this anniversary date, and I suspected we were about to experience something beyond the routine appearances we had been documenting. At 6 o'clock that evening, the sounds from the basement changed dramatically. Instead of the rhythmic tapping we had grown accustomed to, we heard what sounded like multiple voices calling out in distress. The voices seemed to come from within the sealed tunnel, as though people were trapped and calling for rescue. Theodore descended to investigate, and I followed despite his protests. In the basement study, the hidden passage now glowed with a faint light that had no apparent source. The wooden panel that concealed the tunnel entrance had been moved aside, creating a clear opening into the underground passage. "They're ready," Theodore said simply. "After more than a century. They're finally ready to complete their journey home." The voices from the tunnel grew more urgent, clearly calling for assistance from the living world above. Against every instinct for self-preservation, Theodore approached the tunnel entrance. The glowing light from within pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat or breathing, and the voices of the trapped workers became more distinct. I could make out individual words requests for help, directions to safety, and names of people who had died generations earlier. Grandfather sealed them in to prevent the spread of a collapse, Theodore explained, his voice heavy with inherited guilt. He chose to save the living workers above by sacrificing the men already trapped below. They've been waiting for someone to acknowledge that choice and provide them with proper passage home. Marcus appeared at the top of the basement stairs, calling for his father to return upstairs immediately. The main floor was experiencing phenomena that suggested the entire estate was responding to the anniversary. Doors opening and closing, lights flickering, and the sounds of footsteps in empty rooms. Theodore ignored his son's calls and stepped toward the tunnel entrance. As he approached the opening, the light from within grew brighter, and the voices of the trapped miners became welcoming rather than distressed. They recognized him as their employer's descendant, someone with the authority to grant them release. "I'm going to guide them out," Theodore announced. "It's what should have been done 117 years ago." I attempted to dissuade him, but his determination was absolute. The family's wealth had been built on the deaths of these men, and Theodore viewed their liberation as a debt that could no longer be deferred. Theodore entered the tunnel despite my protests and Marcus's increasingly frantic calls from upstairs. The glowing light moved with him as he disappeared into the underground passage, illuminating his path deeper into the mountain. I remained at the entrance, torn between following him and maintaining communication with the family above. The voices in the tunnel grew quieter as Theodore progressed, as though the trapped miners were finally receiving the guidance they had sought for over a century. Through the basement ceiling, I could hear Marcus and Jennifer moving through the main house, presumably preparing for immediate evacuation. 20 minutes after Theodore's departure, the supernatural activity throughout the estate intensified dramatically. Every light in the house flickered simultaneously, and the sound of footsteps echoed from multiple floors and directions. The motion cameras outside detected dozens of figures moving across the property, as though an entire workforce was finally clocking out after the longest shift in history. Then, abruptly, everything stopped. The light stabilized, the footsteps ceased, and the voices from the tunnel fell silent. The basement returned to normal temperature and lighting, and the hidden passage no longer glowed with its mysterious illumination. I waited for 30 minutes before venturing into the tunnel entrance. The passage extended perhaps 50 feet before ending in a natural cave-in that appeared to be centuries old. No recent excavation was evident, and no sign of Theodore could be found. When I returned to report his disappearance, Marcus and Jennifer were loading their car for immediate departure. They accepted my account without questions, as though they had expected this outcome. Local authorities conducted a thorough search of the estate and surrounding mountain terrain, but no trace of Theodore Caldwell was ever discovered. The tunnel passage was examined by experts who confirmed that no one could have passed beyond the cave-in without extensive excavation equipment. Marcus and Jennifer returned to their primary residence and never again visited the Aspen estate. Within 6 months, the property was sold to a development company that demolished the house and converted the land into luxury home sites. The new owners reported no unusual activity during construction or subsequent habitation. The mining records from Theodore's grandfather were donated to the Colorado Historical Society, where they remain archived for researchers studying 19th century extraction operations. The journals documenting supernatural phenomena were retained by the family and have never been made public. I accepted a position managing a different estate in Vermont, where my duties involve no basement levels and no properties with mining history. My final report to the Caldwell family documented only the basic facts. Theodore had disappeared during the night of December 21st while investigating structural issues in the basement, and extensive searches had failed to locate him. Yet I know what I witnessed in that tunnel: light without source, voices without bodies, and the completion of a journey that had been delayed for more than a century. Theodore Caldwell chose to honour his family's debt to the men who had died building their wealth, and in doing so, he joined them in whatever existence they had found beyond the sealed mine. The footprints in the snow stopped appearing after Theodore's disappearance. The security cameras recorded no further nocturnal visitors, and the basement remained quiet throughout the property's final months under Caldwell ownership. It was as though his sacrifice had finally satisfied whatever obligation the family had carried for 5 generations. In the years since, I have researched the mining operation that created the Caldwell fortune. The records confirm that 11 men died in various accidents between 1878 and 1895, when the mine was permanently sealed. Two workers, James Sullivan and Patrick Macready, were indeed trapped by the final cave-in that prompted the closure. I also learned that Theodore's grandfather spent the remainder of his life supporting the families of the deceased workers, providing pensions and education funds that continued for decades after the mine's closure. The estate served not only as the family's vacation retreat, but as a memorial to the men whose deaths had enabled their prosperity. The development company that purchased the property experienced no supernatural activity, but they did uncover additional mining artifacts during construction. The Colorado Historical Society acquired these items, adding them to the collection of Theodore's grandfather's papers and photographs. Sometimes I wonder if Theodore found the peace he sought in the mountain's depths, or if he simply fulfilled an obligation that his family had carried to long. The ethical dimensions of inherited wealth built on human sacrifice are questions that extend far beyond supernatural phenomena, touching on responsibilities that persist across generations. I no longer work winter estates, preferring properties with less complex histories and more straightforward management requirements. Yet I often think about Theodore Caldwell and the choice he made on that December night in Aspen. His decision to enter the tunnel represented more than personal courage. It embodied a recognition that some debts transcend death and demand payment regardless of the cost. The Caldwell estate now exists only in development records and historical archives. The luxury homes that replaced the original house show no awareness of the mountain's previous inhabitants, and their owners enjoy their mountain views, without knowledge of the mining operation that shaped the terrain they find so appealing. But on winter nights, when snow falls heavily and the wind carries sounds that might be voices calling from underground spaces, I remember the footprints that led nowhere and the man who chose to follow them into darkness. Theodore understood something about inherited responsibility that his descendants were unable or unwilling to accept. Some obligations cannot be transferred or abandoned, only fulfilled. The supernatural events at the estate were not hauntings in any traditional sense, but rather the persistence of unfinished business between the living and the dead. When that business was finally resolved through Theodore's ultimate sacrifice, the phenomena ceased because their purpose had been accomplished. I have never returned to Colorado, and I avoid properties with mining histories or extensive basement levels. Some knowledge carries obligations I am not prepared to shoulder, and some footprints lead to destinations from which there may be no return. The mountain keeps its own accounts, and payment, when finally demanded, is always exact.